He always slept naked. When he awoke, he was shocked to find that what weighed on his body wasn't his blanket, but a creature with deep purple skin and glowing eyes. Each of her breaths was a plea for survival, and he could only respond by keeping her close. The bitter cold of winter morning seeped through the wooden walls of the isolated cabin, nestled among the pine and fir trees. The small structure stood as the only sign of human habitation on the hillside. A dirt path, barely visible under fresh snow, connected the cabin to the main road, several hundred meters away. Alvin stirred in his bed. The familiar sensation of skin against sheets, a comfort he'd grown accustomed to in his self-imposed isolation. As a former mercenary, he'd learned to wake instantly at the slightest disturbance. Yet this morning, something felt different. The weight on his chest was not his blanket, but something else, something alive. His eyes snapped open, muscles tensing for combat. What he saw paralyzed him momentarily. A woman, or something resembling a woman, lay across his chest. Her skin was an impossible shade of purple, almost iridescent in the dim morning light that filtered through the window. But most striking were her eyes, luminous orbs that seemed to glow from within, casting a faint, violet hue across his bare skin. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying a melodic quality unlike anything he'd heard before. "I'm freezing. If they find me, I'll die." Instinctively, Alvin reached for the knife he kept beneath his pillow, but found himself hesitating. Despite the alien appearance of the intruder, there was something vulnerable in her gaze, a desperation that resonated with him on a level he couldn't immediately identify. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" he demanded, voice low and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The creature trembled against him, her skin unnaturally cool to the touch. "My name is Celia," she managed between shivering breaths. "I need warmth. Your heat signature was perfect." Alvin's mind raced. 1,000 possibilities flashed through his thoughts, none of them good. He'd retreated to this remote cabin specifically to avoid complications, to escape the violence and chaos that had defined his previous life. Yet, here was trouble, literally lying on top of him. "Get off me," he said firmly, trying to shift his weight to dislodge her without actually touching her more than necessary. "I can't," she replied, her luminous eyes dimming slightly. "My body temperature will drop to fatal levels if I move away from your heat source. I am not adapted to your planet's climate." "Your planet?" The words hung in the air between them. Alvin had seen strange things during his years as a mercenary, but nothing like this. Despite his better judgment, curiosity began to override caution. "You're saying you're not human?" "Correct." "And you broke into my cabin because I detected your thermal signature. My species is cold-blooded. We require external heat sources to maintain core body functions." Celia's voice grew slightly stronger as she absorbed more of his body heat. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I had no choice. I'm being hunted." Alvin's hand still hovered near his knife. Years of training had taught him to trust no one, especially not strange intruders with implausible stories. Yet, as he studied her, he noted the absence of visible weapons. Her hands were empty, her strange, purple skin exposed by the simple, silvery garment she wore. If she'd wanted to kill him, she'd had ample opportunity while he slept. "Hunted by whom?" he asked, relaxing fractionally. "By my people, the royal enforcers." She closed her eyes briefly, as though the words themselves caused her pain. Was a royal. I escaped an arranged marriage designed to turn me into a weapon. If they find me, they'll either drag me back or eliminate me to prevent political fallout." It sounded ridiculous, like something from a bad science fiction novel. Yet, Alvin had seen enough of the world to know that truth often surpassed fiction in its strangeness. You can stay until sunrise, he finally said, pulling the blanket over both of them. It was a calculated risk. If she was telling the truth, sending her out into the cold would be a death sentence. If she was lying, well, he'd dealt with worse threats. After that, we figure out what to do with you. Relief washed over Celia's features, the glow of her eyes intensifying momentarily. Thank you, she whispered, settling more comfortably against him. Alvin stared at the ceiling, hyper-aware of the alien warmth slowly developing where their bodies touched. Dawn was still hours away, and he knew sleep would not return easily with a stranger, an alien stranger, pressed against him. Yet, as the minutes passed, he found himself studying the rhythm of her breathing, the way her chest rose and fell in a pattern just slightly different from human respiration. She truly wasn't human. The realization settled over him like the blanket they now shared, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to consider. Morning light was streaming through the cabin windows when Alvin next opened his eyes. He'd fallen asleep after all, a dangerous lapse in vigilance that would have earned him a severe reprimand in his mercenary days. Celia still lay beside him, though she'd shifted during the night so that they were face to face, her alien features somehow less startling in the golden light of dawn. She was awake, watching him with those luminous eyes. Your body temperature fluctuated during sleep, she said matter-of-factly. Fascinating adaptation. Alvin sat up abruptly, acutely aware of his nakedness beneath the sheets. That's enough observation for now, he muttered, reaching for clothes beside the bed. Stay there while I get dressed. He pulled on cargo pants and a thermal shirt, then headed to the cabin's small kitchen to prepare coffee. His mind raced with possibilities. If Celia's story was true, harboring her could bring danger to his doorstep, precisely the sort of complication he'd sought to avoid by retreating to this isolated spot. Yet the alternative was to turn her out to face whatever pursued her, a prospect that stirred uncomfortable memories of his own past. When he returned to the bedroom, she was examining the space with evident curiosity, running her purple fingers along the grain of the wooden walls. Your dwelling is remarkably inefficient at heat retention, she observed. Yet you've compensated with multiple layers of insulation. It's a work in progress, Alvin replied, handing her a mug of steaming coffee. Drink this. It'll warm you from the inside. Celia accepted the mug cautiously, inhaling the steam rising from its surface. Compounds similar to those on my world, she murmured, before taking a small sip. Her eyes widened. Stimulant? Caffeine, Alvin confirmed. Look, we need to talk about what happens next. I live here because I don't want complications. You're definitely a complication. I understand. Celia set the mug down on the bedside table, her movements deliberate and precise. I will leave if that is your wish. But I should warn you, they may have already tracked me to this location. Alvin tensed. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, Celia knelt beside the bed and reached underneath it. When her hand emerged, it held a small, metallic device, no larger than a coin. Thermal tracker, she explained. Planted here before my arrival. It's not one of mine. Cold dread washed over Alvin. He took the device from her, examining it with growing concern. It was unlike any technology he'd seen before, sleeker, more advanced than even the military-grade equipment he'd encountered during his service. They're already here, he said flatly. It wasn't a question. Celia nodded, her luminous eyes dimming slightly. The trackers are deployed ahead of the enforcers. We have perhaps hours before they arrive. We? Alvin raised an eyebrow. I didn't sign up for this. No, you didn't, she agreed, her voice soft but steady. But by allowing me to stay the night, you've already been marked as an accomplice. In their eyes, you're as guilty as I am. Alvin swore under his breath. years of combat instincts kicking in as he mentally cataloged the weapons he had stashed around the cabin. It wouldn't be enough against the kind of technology Celia's pursuers possessed, but it might buy them time. "Tell me exactly what we're up against," he demanded, moving to the cabin's main room, where he kept a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Celia followed, her movements becoming more fluid as her body temperature stabilized. The Royal Enforcers use a tiered approach. First, they deploy scouts, low-ranking soldiers equipped with basic weapons and tracking technology. They're expendable, used primarily to confirm a target's location. Alvin retrieved a tactical knife and a handgun from the compartment, checking the ammunition with practiced efficiency. And, after the scouts, Royal bodyguards, heavily armored, trained specifically to neutralize and capture high-value targets. Celia watched him arm himself, her expression unreadable. Beyond them, the dropship contains more specialized units. I've never seen them deployed, but they're said to be thorough. "Great," Alvin muttered. "And what about you? Any special abilities I should know about? Can you fight?" A faint smile touched Celia's purple lips. "I was being trained as a weapon, remember? But my capabilities are limited in your planet's atmosphere and temperature. I require consistent heat to function optimally." Alvin nodded, processing this information as he continued to gather supplies. "So you stick close to me. We'll need to eliminate that tracker and set up false heat signatures to throw them off." "You're helping me?" Celia asked, genuine surprise coloring her tone. Alvin paused, meeting her luminous gaze. "They've already marked me as an accomplice, right? Besides, I've never been good at running away from a fight." Something shifted in Celia's expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or respect. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Alvin replied grimly. "First, we need to clean this place up, melt down any trace of alien tech, and prepare some surprises for our visitors." Over the next few hours, Alvin and Celia worked methodically to erase evidence of her presence. They melted the tracking device in the cabin's wood stove, along with several other small pieces of technology Celia had brought with her. Alvin showed her the subtle secrets of the surrounding forest, the hidden paths, the deadfalls that could become traps, the rocky outcropping that concealed a cave system once used by smugglers. As they worked, Celia revealed more about herself and her world. She was indeed royalty, a member of the Tier 1 climate caste, engineered for strategic political alliances. Her arranged marriage would have bound her to a military commander from a rival kingdom, giving him access to her unique biological capabilities. "What exactly are these capabilities?" Alvin asked, as they rigged a series of false heat signatures using modified heating elements from the cabin's space heaters. Celia hesitated before answering. "My species can adapt our biological functions to interface with certain technologies. The marriage would have essentially turned me into a living weapon system, my consciousness bound to military hardware." Alvin's hands stilled on the device he was modifying. "That sounds like slavery." "It is our way," Celia replied, though the dimming of her luminous eyes suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. Or rather, it was, "I chose differently." As dusk approached, the forest grew quieter, the usual chattering of birds falling silent in a way that raised the hairs on Alvin's neck. They were running out of time. "They're here," he murmured, checking his weapons one final time. "We need to move now." Celia nodded, pulling closer to absorb his body heat. The temperature had dropped significantly with nightfall, and Alvin could feel her skin growing cooler against his. "Stay close," he instructed, as they slipped out the cabin's back door. "We're going to lead them into an ambush, using the false heat signatures to draw them away from our actual position." They moved silently through the darkening forest, Alvin leading with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Celia followed closely, occasionally touching his arm or back to maintain the thermal connection she needed to function. Despite the danger of their situation, Alvin found himself increasingly aware of these points of contact, the alien coolness of her skin, gradually warming where it touched his. They reached the cave entrance just as full darkness descended. Alvin activated the first of the false heat signatures, placing it in a clearing about 50 meters from their position. "When they come to investigate, we'll circle behind them," he whispered. "Take out the scouts first, then deal with whatever comes next." Celia nodded, her eyes glowing more intensely in the darkness. "I detect movement," she murmured. "Two heat signatures approaching from the north. Humanoid. But with technological augmentation." Alvin strained his senses, but could detect nothing. Whatever abilities Celia possessed, they exceeded normal human perception. He trusted her assessment and positioned himself accordingly, tactical knife ready in his hand. They didn't have to wait long. Two figures emerged into the clearing, moving with mechanical precision as they investigated the false heat signature. Their armor was unlike anything Alvin had seen. Sleek, almost organic in its design, with pulsing lights that reminded him disturbingly of veins carrying blood. He signaled to Celia, and they moved in perfect synchronization, approaching the scouts from behind. Alvin struck first, his knife finding the gap in the first scout's armor at the neck joint. The figure collapsed with barely a sound. Celia moved with unexpected grace, producing a thin, needle-like weapon that pulsed with energy. She drove it into the second scout's chest, and the armor seemed to short-circuit, its pulsing lights fading as the figure crumpled. "Energy blade," she explained quietly, seeing Alvin's questioning look. "Disrupts their biotech interface." They had no time to celebrate the small victory. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "Dropship," Celia whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We need to get to the cave, now!" They ran, abandoning stealth for speed as the humming intensified. Alvin could feel the air pressure changing as something massive displaced the atmosphere above them. Just as they reached the cave entrance, a blinding light swept the forest floor, illuminating everything in harsh, white clarity. Inside the cave, they pressed against the cool stone walls, breathing heavily. Alvin peered cautiously out to see a craft unlike any he'd encountered before. Not quite a helicopter, not quite a plane, hovering silently above the clearing where they'd left the scouts. "They'll find the bodies," he said grimly, "and then they'll widen the search." Celia nodded, her luminous eyes the only source of light in the darkness of the cave. "We need to go deeper. There are natural formations that will mask our heat signatures." They moved further into the cave system, Celia leading now as her superior night vision proved invaluable in the darkness. The temperature dropped further as they descended, and Alvin noticed her movements becoming sluggish again. "Here," he said, pulling her against him. "Take what you need." She hesitated only briefly before pressing herself against his chest, her arms encircling his waist. They stood like that for several minutes, an intimate embrace born of necessity rather than affection. Yet, as Celia's body temperature rose, Alvin found himself oddly reluctant to release her. "Thank you," she murmured, her face tilted up toward his, in the dim violet light cast by her eyes. Her alien features seemed almost beautiful, exotic rather than strange. A sudden explosion shattered the moment, the concussion wave reaching them, even deep within the cave. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. "They're using plasma charges to flush us out," Celia explained, pulling away reluctantly. "The cave won't protect us for long." Alvin's mind raced, evaluating their limited options. "We need to split their forces," he decided. "I'll activate the remaining false signatures in sequence. Make them think we're trying to escape through the far side of the forest. While they're distracted, we double back to the cabin," Celia finished, understanding his plan immediately. "Smart. but dangerous. You'd be exposed. I've been in worse situations, Alvin replied with a grim smile. Stay here until I return. If I'm not back in 30 minutes. I'll freeze to death without your body heat, she interrupted flatly. We go together or not at all. Alvin wanted to argue, but she was right. Their survival was now interdependent in the most literal sense. Fine, but stay low and move exactly as I do. They crept back toward the cave entrance, pausing frequently to listen for pursuit. The dropship had moved off, its humming fading into the distance, but Alvin knew better than to assume they were safe. As they neared the entrance, he spotted two more figures, larger than the scouts, encased in heavier armor that gleamed dully in the moonlight. Royal bodyguards, Celia whispered, her breath warm against his ear. They'll have more advanced weapons. As if to confirm her warning, one of the figures raised an arm and a beam of concentrated light, not quite a laser, but something similar, sliced through a nearby tree. The massive trunk toppled with a deafening crash. Plasma cutter, Alvin muttered. Great. They retreated deeper into the cave, reconsidering their options. The heavy footsteps of the bodyguards grew louder as they approached the entrance. We need a diversion, Celia said, her eyes scanning the cave's interior. Something to draw them away from the entrance. Alvin nodded, reaching into his pack for the last of the false heat signatures. I can set this to overheat. It'll create a massive thermal bloom deeper in the cave system. Might buy us a few minutes. He quickly modified the device, setting it to generate maximum heat, before placing it as far back in the cave as he dared go. They retreated to a side passage, watching as the bodyguards entered, their helmet visors scanning methodically for heat signatures. The diversion worked better than expected. When the device overheated, it didn't just create a thermal signature, it exploded, the concussion echoing through the cave system like a thunderclap. The bodyguards immediately moved toward the source, their heavy footsteps receding into the darkness. Now, Alvin whispered, and they slipped out of the cave entrance into the night. The forest was eerily quiet, the local wildlife silenced by the unnatural presence of the hunters. Alvin and Celia moved with practiced stealth, staying low and using the trees for cover as they made their way back toward the cabin. They had nearly reached it when the dropship returned, its searchlight sweeping the forest floor in methodical patterns. They froze, pressing themselves against the trunk of a massive pine as the light passed just meters away. Celia's body trembled against Alvin's, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. Instinctively, he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer to share his warmth. The searchlight passed again, closer this time. Alvin held his breath, acutely aware that the slightest movement could give them away. Beside him, Celia was so still, she might have been a statue, only the faint glow of her eyes betraying her alien nature. Finally, the light moved on, the dropship continuing its search pattern away from their position. They waited several more minutes before resuming their cautious approach to the cabin. Once inside, Alvin immediately began gathering essential supplies, food, water, ammunition, and a portable heater he'd rigged for emergencies. We can't stay here, he explained as he worked. They'll come back to search the cabin more thoroughly. Celia nodded, helping to pack the supplies into rugged backpacks. Where will we go? There's an old mining tunnel about 2 miles east, Alvin replied. Abandoned decades ago, but solid construction. We can hole up there until we figure out a more permanent solution. They worked in efficient silence, each recognizing the gravity of their situation. As Alvin checked his weapon one final time, a thought occurred to him. You said they tracked you here with thermal sensors. What if we could fake our deaths, create heat signatures that suddenly vanish, make them think we were caught in one of their plasma blasts? Celia's luminous eyes widened. It could work. The Royal Enforcers rely heavily on their technology. They rarely verify kills physically if the sensors confirm termination. Do you have any way to communicate with their systems? Make them think they've received confirmation? A slow smile spread across Celia's purple features. I told you I was being trained as a weapon. Part of that training included interfacing with communication networks. She reached into a hidden pocket in her silvery garment and produced a small, crystalline device. This contains my biological signature. If I can modify it to transmit a termination code— Do it, Alvin urged, impressed despite himself. Perhaps harboring an alien fugitive wasn't the worst decision he'd ever made. While Celia worked on modifying the device, Alvin prepared for their departure. The cabin had served him well, but he felt oddly untroubled by the prospect of leaving it behind. After years of isolation, the sudden infusion of danger and companionship had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. It's ready, Celia announced, holding up the modified crystal. When activated, it will transmit false biological readings indicating catastrophic system failure. Death, in simpler terms. Will they believe it? The data comes from my own biological matrix, she explained. It's as authentic as possible without actually killing me. Alvin nodded, shouldering his pack. Then let's go. We'll activate it once we're safely away from here. They slipped out the back door once more, this time heading east toward the abandoned mine. The forest was quieter now, the dropships humming having faded into the distance. Alvin led the way, his years of mercenary training allowing him to move almost silently, despite the darkness and rough terrain. Celia kept pace remarkably well for someone not adapted to Earth's environment, though Alvin noticed she stayed close enough to benefit from his body heat. The night air had grown colder, and he could see her breath forming small clouds of vapor with each exhalation. They had covered nearly half the distance to the mine when a sound froze them both in place, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, coming from somewhere ahead. Alvin signaled for Celia to stay put, then crept forward to investigate. Through the trees, he spotted another royal bodyguard, this one moving more deliberately than the others they'd encountered. The armor was different too, more ornate, with glowing symbols etched into its surface. "Commander," Celia whispered when he returned to report what he'd seen. "A higher-ranking officer. They're taking my escape very seriously. Can we go around?" She shook her head. "They'll have deployed a perimeter grid by now. Breaking through will trigger alarms." Alvin considered their options, none of them good. "Then we fight," he decided. "One target, quick and clean." Celia touched his arm, her fingers surprisingly warm now. "Let me," she said. "I know their weaknesses." Before Alvin could protest, she had slipped away, moving with a grace that belied her alien physiology. He followed at a distance, weapon ready, watching as she circled to approach the commander from behind. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Celia produced her energy blade again, but this time used it differently, not stabbing, but slicing in a precise pattern across the commander's armor. The glowing symbols flickered and died, and the figure inside convulsed before collapsing to the ground. "Bio-neural interface points," Celia explained as Alvin joined her. "Disrupt them, and the connection between pilot and armor fails." Alvin stared at the fallen commander, impressed by the efficiency of Celia's attack. "Remind me not to get on your bad side," he muttered. A faint smile touched her lips. "You've shown me nothing but kindness. I have no bad side where you're concerned." The moment of connection between them was broken by a familiar humming. The dropship was returning. Without a word, they both began running toward the mine entrance, abandoning stealth for speed. They reached the abandoned mine just as the searchlight began sweeping the forest behind them. The entrance was partially collapsed, requiring them to squeeze through a narrow opening into the darkness beyond. Inside, the air was stale but significantly warmer than outside, a blessing for Celia's cold-blooded physiology. Alvin produced a small, battery-powered lantern from his pack, illuminating a tunnel that stretched into the mountain. Old mining equipment lay scattered about, rusted and forgotten. "We should be safe here for now," he said, setting down his pack. "Let's activate that death signal and hope they buy it." Celia nodded, producing the crystal device. Once activated, it will transmit for approximately 3 hours before burning out. That should be sufficient to convince them. She pressed a sequence of points on the crystal surface, and it began to glow with an internal light, pulsing in a rhythm that reminded Alvin of a heartbeat, gradually growing weaker until it finally stopped. "Now we wait," she said, setting the device on a nearby rock. They made themselves as comfortable as possible in the confines of the mine, using supplies from Alvin's pack to create a small camp. The portable heater provided much-needed warmth for Celia, who positioned herself as close to it as possible. "How long have you been on Earth?" Alvin asked, as he distributed rations, protein bars, and dried fruit. "Not luxurious, but nutritious." 17 of your days," Celia replied, accepting the food with a grateful nod. "My escape pod landed in the mountains to the north. I've been moving south, searching for a suitable environment." "And you found me?" "Yes." Her luminous eyes met his, unblinking. "Your thermal signature was perfect, sustained, isolated, yet strong enough to support my needs." Alvin shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "You make it sound like you were hunting me." "In a sense. Survival required it." She looked down at the food in her hands. "I apologize if that disturbs you." Strangely, it didn't disturb him as much as it perhaps should have. After years of isolation, being needed, even by an alien fugitive, stirred something within him that had lain dormant for too long. "How long until they give up the search?" he asked, changing the subject. "If they believe the termination signal, they'll conduct a final sweep of the area tomorrow, then withdraw." Celia took a small bite of the protein bar, her expression suggesting she found the taste unusual, but not unpleasant. "Their mission parameters are strict. Resources are not to be wasted on confirmed eliminations." "And if they don't believe it?" She met his gaze again, her expression solemn. "Then we've merely bought ourselves time." They lapsed into silence, the gravity of their situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Outside, the night grew deeper, the temperature dropping further. Inside the mine, the portable heater fought valiantly against the cold, creating a small bubble of warmth in the darkness. As the hours passed, Alvin found himself studying Celia with increasing fascination. Her alien features, initially so jarring, had begun to take on a strange beauty in his eyes. The way her purple skin caught the light of the lantern, the subtle glow of her eyes that intensified or dimmed with her emotions. All of it spoke of a life form so different from his own, yet fundamentally similar in its desire for freedom and safety. "Why did you help me?" Celia asked suddenly, breaking the long silence. "You could have turned me over to them, or simply sent me away." Alvin considered the question, surprised to find he didn't have a ready answer. "I've seen enough of what happens when the powerful use the vulnerable as pawns," he said finally. "I didn't want to be part of that. Not again." "Again," she repeated softly. "You speak from experience." "I was a mercenary for 15 years, Alvin explained, his voice growing distant as memories surfaced. "Started as idealism, fighting for causes I believed in. Ended as just another gun for hire, following orders without questioning what they really meant." "What changed?" "My last assignment. We were told we were protecting mining interests from terrorists. Turned out the terrorists were indigenous people protecting their ancestral lands." Alvin's hands clenched involuntarily. "By the time I realized the truth, there was blood on my hands that would never wash clean." Celia was silent for a long moment, her luminous eyes studying him with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable. Instead, he found himself meeting her gaze, allowing her to see the guilt and regret he normally kept carefully hidden. "On my world," she said finally, "we have a concept called Kishan, the rebirth of purpose. When one life path ends, another begins. You're helping me. Perhaps this is your Kishan." The idea resonated with something deep within Alvin, a hope he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Before he could respond, however, a faint tremor ran through the ground beneath them, accompanied by a distant rumbling. "They're using plasma charges again," Celia said, tensing. Searching the forest systematically, Alvin moved to the mine entrance, peering out into the darkness. In the distance, he could see flashes of light as explosions tore through the forest. The dropship hovered above it all, its searchlight illuminating the destruction below. "They're getting closer," he warned. "We should move deeper into the mine." They quickly packed up their small camp, Alvin taking the lead with the lantern as they ventured further into the tunnel. The passage narrowed in places, forcing them to proceed in single file, but always continued deeper into the mountain. After nearly an hour of careful progress, they emerged into a larger chamber, an expansion point where miners had once gathered to rest and eat between shifts. Old tables and benches, partially rotted but still functional, offered a more comfortable resting place than the tunnel floor. "We should be safe here," Alvin said, setting up the heater once more. "Those charges won't penetrate this deep, and the mountain itself should mask any heat signatures." Celia nodded, though Alvin noticed she seemed more subdued than before. Her movements were slower, the glow of her eyes dimmer. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern overriding caution as he moved closer to her. "The extended exertion in this cold environment has taxed my biological reserves," she admitted. "I require more heat than the portable unit can provide." Without hesitation, Alvin sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. "Take what you need," he said simply. Celia leaned into him gratefully, her cooler body temperature gradually warming where it pressed against his. They sat like that in silence, the soft hum of the heater and their quiet breathing the only sounds in the vast emptiness of the mine. "Tell me about your world," Alvin said after a while, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract them both from their precarious situation. Celia's expression softened, the glow of her eyes intensifying slightly. "It is beautiful, in its way, colder than Earth, with 3 moons that create complex tidal patterns in our oceans. The sky is never truly dark, always illuminated by one moon or another." "And your people? What are they like?" "Hierarchical, structured around castes determined by thermal adaptation." Her voice took on a more formal quality, as though reciting facts learned in childhood. "The higher castes generate more internal heat, allowing them to occupy the most desirable territories near the equator. Lower castes are more dependent on external heat sources, relegated to communal heating centers in the outer territories." "And where do you fit in this hierarchy?" was, of the thermal aristocracy, engineered for optimal heat regulation, capable of adapting to multiple environments." A hint of bitterness crept into her tone. "A valuable commodity in political negotiations." Alvin frowned. "You make it sound like you were property, not a person. The distinction is less clear in my culture than in yours." Celia shifted slightly, pressing closer to his warmth. "Individual autonomy is a concept I've only begun to truly understand since arriving on Earth. The implication that Earth, with all its flaws and injustices, represented freedom to her was sobering." Alvin found himself wondering what her life had been like before her escape, how desperate she must have been to flee to an alien world with no guarantee of survival. As if reading his thoughts, Celia continued. "The arranged marriage would have been my final loss of self. Once bonded to the military commander, my consciousness would have become subordinate to the weapon systems I was meant to control. A living interface, aware but unable to act independently." "That's..." Horrific, Alvin said, instinctively tightening his arm around her. It is our way, she replied, though the words sounded hollow, as though she no longer believed them herself. Or it was. I chose differently. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the distant rumbling of explosions had ceased, suggesting either the search had moved on or, hopefully, the termination signal had been accepted. Hours passed. Alvin dozed intermittently, always waking with a start at the slightest sound. Celia remained awake, her luminous eyes never fully closing, though they dimmed to a faint glow during periods of rest. When Alvin next checked his watch, nearly 8 hours had passed since they'd activated the termination signal. If Celia was right, the Royal Enforcers should be concluding their final sweep of the area soon. We should check if it's safe, he suggested, stretching to relieve the stiffness in his muscles. Celia nodded, though she seemed reluctant to move away from his warmth. The commander I disabled would have been missed by now. They'll either have recovered him or written him off as another casualty. They packed up once more, this time moving with greater caution as they retraced their path toward the mine entrance. The tunnel seemed longer on the return journey, each step bringing them closer to potential danger. When they finally reached the entrance, dawn was breaking, painting the forest in soft, golden light. Alvin peered out cautiously, scanning for any sign of the dropship or royal bodyguards. The forest was quiet, not the unnatural silence of the previous night, but the peaceful quiet of early morning, broken occasionally by birdsong. It seemed their ruse had worked. I think they're gone, Alvin said, relief evident in his voice. The signal must have convinced them. Celia joined him at the entrance, her luminous eyes scanning the forest with greater sensitivity than his human vision. Yes, she confirmed after a moment. I detect no artificial heat signatures within range. They've withdrawn. They emerged from the mine cautiously, still wary despite their confidence that the danger had passed. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more alive. A fine mist hung between the trees, diffusing the morning sunlight into a soft, ethereal glow. What now? Celia asked, turning to face Alvin. In the natural light, her purple skin seemed less alien, more like an unusual, but not impossible human variation. It was a good question. Alvin had lived in isolation for so long that the prospect of change, of companionship, was both thrilling and terrifying. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence, after everything they'd shared, left a hollow feeling in his chest. We could go back to the cabin, he suggested. Assess the damage. See if it's still habitable. Celia nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. And after that? One step at a time, Alvin replied, unwilling to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. First, let's make sure we're really safe. They made their way back toward the cabin, moving with less urgency now, but still maintaining a cautious awareness of their surroundings. The forest showed signs of the previous night's violence, trees splintered by plasma charges, scorched earth where energy weapons had discharged. As they neared the cabin, they paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the structure for any signs of damage or surveillance. The building stood intact, though the door hung open, evidence of a hasty search by the Royal Enforcers. Wait here, Alvin instructed, drawing his handgun. I'll check if it's clear. He approached the cabin slowly, senses alert for any trap or hidden observer. Inside, the space had been thoroughly ransacked, furniture overturned, floorboards pried up, walls punctured in places as though the searchers had been looking for hidden compartments. But it was empty of life, the silence confirming what their other observations had suggested. The hunters had moved on. Alvin signaled to Celia, who quickly joined him inside. Together, they began the process of restoring order to the chaos, righting furniture and sweeping up broken glass and splintered wood. They were thorough, Celia observed, as she helped Alvin reassemble the bed frame. looking for any trace of my technology or biological material. Did they find anything important? She shook her head. We destroyed or removed everything significant. What remained would have been insufficient to track us once the termination signal was accepted. As they worked, Alvin found himself watching Celia with growing fascination. Despite her alien appearance, her movements had a grace that seemed almost familiar now. The initial strangeness of her purple skin and luminous eyes had faded, replaced by an appreciation for their unique beauty. By midday, they had restored a semblance of order to the cabin. Exhaustion from their night-long ordeal caught up with them, and they found themselves sitting side by side on the repaired bed, shoulders touching as they leaned against the wall. We should rest, Alvin suggested, noting the dimming glow of Celia's eyes. We're safe enough for now. She nodded, already sliding down to lie on the bed. Alvin hesitated only briefly before joining her, pulling the blanket over both of them, just as he had that first night. This time, however, there was no fear or suspicion in the gesture, only the natural desire to provide the warmth she needed. Celia curled against him, her body fitting against his, as though designed for that purpose. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or the release of tension after their narrow escape, but Alvin found himself wrapping an arm around her, pulling her closer than strictly necessary for heat transfer. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft with approaching sleep. "For everything." Alvin didn't respond with words, but the gentle tightening of his arm around her waist conveyed what he wasn't ready to say aloud. As sleep claimed him, his last conscious thought was how strange it was that the most connection he'd felt in years was with someone from another world entirely. They slept through the remainder of the day and into the evening, bodies and minds recovering from the strain of their ordeal. When Alvin finally awoke, night had fallen once more, bathing the cabin in silver moonlight that filtered through the windows. Celia still slept beside him, her breathing slow and even, the glow of her eyes visible even through closed lids, a faint purple light that pulsed gently with each heartbeat. In the ethereal moonlight, she looked almost magical, a being from another realm rather than another planet. Carefully, so as not to wake her, Alvin extricated himself from their shared embrace and moved to the window. The forest was peaceful, no sign of the violence that had torn through it the previous night. Stars glittered overhead, countless pinpoints of light in the vast darkness. One of those distant stars was Celia's sun, he realized. Her home, now forever closed to her if their deception had worked. The thought filled him with a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for what she had lost, gratitude that her path had crossed his, and a growing sense of responsibility for her future on this alien world. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Alvin turned to find Celia awake, watching him from the bed. She sat up, the blanket falling away to reveal her silvery garment, now tattered and stained from their adventures. "The night sky," she continued, moving to join him at the window. "So different from mine, yet equally vast, equally humbling." "Do you miss it?" Alvin asked. "Your home?" Celia was silent for a long moment, her luminous eyes fixed on the stars above. "I miss what it could have been," she said finally. "A world of choice and dignity, rather than hierarchy and obligation." She turned to face him, her expression more vulnerable than he had yet seen it. "But such a world never truly existed for me there. Perhaps it can exist here." The implication hung between them, a question neither was quite ready to articulate. Instead, Alvin found himself reaching out, his fingers brushing against the smooth, purple skin of her cheek. Celia leaned into the touch, her eyes dimming slightly in what he now recognized as an expression of contentment. "We should gather what remains of your technology," he said, practical concerns intruding on the moment. "Burn it, bury it, make sure there's nothing left to track." Celia nodded, stepping back slightly. Yes, a final severance from my past life. They spent the next hour collecting every piece of alien technology they could find. Fragments of the tracking device, components from Celia's emergency survival gear, the crystalline communicator that had transmitted the termination signal. Alvin built a small fire outside, far enough from the cabin to avoid any risk to the structure. As the flames consumed the last physical links to her former existence, Celia stood with her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression a complex mixture of grief and liberation. Alvin stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, offering silent support. "If I stay here," she said as the fire began to die down, "I will no longer be a fugitive. I will be free." "Is that what you want?" Alvin asked, his voice low, uncertain. Celia turned to face him fully, her luminous eyes searching his. "I never allowed myself to want anything permanent before. Survival was enough. But now—" She reached out, her fingers tentatively touching his hand. "Now I find myself wanting more than mere existence." Alvin looked down at their joined hands, hers purple and slightly cooler, his tan and warm, different in almost every way, yet fitting together with surprising ease. He thought of his years of isolation, of the guilt and regret that had driven him to this remote cabin in the first place, of how, in the space of just a few days, his world had expanded beyond recognition. "I never wanted anything long-term either," he admitted, squeezing her hand gently. "But now, I think I want a home." The word held a weight it never had before, not just a physical structure, but a place of belonging, of connection. Celia's eyes brightened, the glow intensifying with what Alvin now recognized as joy. "Then let us build one," she said simply. Together, in the dying light of the fire that had consumed her past. Alvin pulled Celia closer, no longer just a source of heat, but a companion, a partner. As they turned back toward the cabin, toward their future, the stars overhead seemed to shine just a little brighter, witnesses to a new beginning born from the most unlikely of meetings. He had slept unclothed. When he woke, she had been on top of him, an alien, a fugitive, a being from another world. Now, as they walked hand in hand toward the dwelling they would make into a home, Alvin realized that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys began with the simplest of moments. And sometimes the warmth one person could offer another went far beyond the merely physical. It was enough. It was everything.